This is a pre-recorded presentation on the topic of 5317 Glenwood Avenue for presentation at the June 12th, 2023 Planning Commission meeting. The applicant is petitioning for two city approvals tonight: the minor subdivision of an existing property into two single-family residential lots, as well as a subdivision variance of 6.56 feet off of the required 160 feet that would otherwise be required to split the parcel. The property is located in the southeast portion of the city on the south side of Glenwood Avenue and just west of Highway 100. As can be seen, this property is currently zoned for single-family residential use and is surrounded largely by other single-family residential properties, with institutional properties to the north and west and some medium-density residential as well to the west. Here we have an aerial photograph of the site to provide more context. This was taken in 2021. To provide some background on the site, 5317 Glenwood Ave is the address of a home built in 1926. You can see from the aerial photograph here that it's situated primarily on the east portion of the lot, with the west side being mostly undeveloped open space. The lot as a whole is 31,720 square feet and has a width of 153.44 feet at the front setback line. Topography here is lower compared to some other nearby lots and generally slopes down towards the west, leading to further stormwater runoff challenges to be managed. The existing utility hookups are in place for the home today, but there would need to be an additional set of private connections for an eventual second home if subdivided. And then finally, Glenwood Ave is the primary frontage for the property. It's to the north. This is considered a county road and does have some restrictions on its use from the county. The proposal from Lake West Developments is to subdivide the property to create two single-family lots. The existing home would remain on the east parcel and would be remodeled to improve its livability, and it would also meet the 12.5-foot side setback with the newly created internal lot line between the two. There would also be a new home to be created on the west lot that would then be subject to current zoning standards. Both of these lots would exceed the area requirements for new R1 parcels, but both would fall slightly short of the required 80 feet in width, necessitating that subdivision variance. In addition to the work subdividing the properties and building a new home on one of them, there would also be a large amount of work to regrade the properties in order to correct drainage patterns. To the right, you can see a portion of the preliminary plat, and you can see here the west lot being 16,712 square feet in area and having a width of 78.05 feet, and then the east lot being 15,070 square feet in area and having a width of 75.39 feet in width. Drainage utility easements would need to be dedicated across all property lines and are shown on the preliminary plat. Here we have a pair of exhibits provided by the applicant to demonstrate the change in grading patterns through the project. On the left, we have the existing patterns, which largely just drain to the west and into other residential lots. And on the right, the revised drainage patterns, largely pushing that stormwater runoff towards the street or south through a corner intersection with two other lots towards the street on that south side. Because this action would require an additional subdivision variance to be approved, a neighborhood meeting was required to be held and was held on May 31st. There were 3 residents that attended in person and 1 remotely. Those that were in support of the project liked the improvements to grading and that the existing home was being preserved as part of the project. Some residents did note that splitting the parcel would not allow the otherwise large lot to be overdeveloped as a large-scale tear-down and rebuild project. Some of the residents did have questions, though, and concerns around the plans for stormwater management. They noted that given drought conditions in previous years, would it make sense to handle more of that stormwater on site through reuse options or green infrastructure such as a rain garden, rather than directing that water to the street and city storm sewer. In terms of staff review for the subdivision requirements, the major outlier here is, of course, the lot widths that are being proposed. The typical requirement for an internal lot being created today would be 80 feet in width. In this case, both lots would not meet that requirement. However, they would meet the lot area and the lot depth requirements of that same requirement section of code. From our engineering staff's perspective, despite those steep slopes present, they saw no issues with considering the site buildable and did not note any wetlands or floodplains present. They also noted that the second lot, again, would require new utility hookups, but that city services were available under Glenwood Avenue and would not require any additional investment. Because the county does control the right-of-way around Glenwood Avenue, there were some initial conversations between themselves, the applicant, and our city engineering staff on the management of stormwater, as well as the amount of curb cuts or driveways coming off the new properties to that county road. Initially, the county had been interested in a shared driveway where there would only be a single curb cut. However, at the most recent discussions between those groups, they have identified the possible use of hammerhead driveways for two separate driveways for those two properties. The hammerhead driveways allowing vehicles to turn around on the lot itself and not have to reverse onto the busier Glenwood Ave. Staff will also note that tree mitigation and replacement requirements would apply towards the redevelopment, although our environmental staff had no comments at this time. And then finally, there were no comments or concerns from the fire department or building inspections department relating to the subdivision. In order to be considered a minor subdivision or minor consolidation, there are three factors of eligibility that must be met by the action. Firstly, that the land to be subdivided must be part of a recorded plat, which is met by this project. Secondly, that the subdivision cannot create more than 4 lots, which again would only be creating 2. And then finally, the subdivision or consolidation shall not necessitate any additional public investment in new roads or utilities, which again, we are not anticipating any public investment. In the case of the subdivision variance, these are evaluated based on similar but slightly different standards from a typical zoning's variance. These standards are laid out in the code section 109-5A1. In addition to the kind of strict conditions of approval, the council and commission may also consider surrounding uses, the resulting population density of the subdivision, and then the traffic impacts of said division. The first standard for that subdivision variance that must be met is that there are special circumstances so that the strict application of the requirements would create unusual hardship and deprive the applicant of reasonable use of the land. In this case, staff looks at the land and sees that the oversized nature of the lot for a single-family home, as well as the ability to preserve that existing home even with a split without creating any non-conforming setbacks, staff feels that the subdivision action is reasonable despite not meeting the letter of the code for lot width. Secondly, that the variance is necessary for the preservation and enjoyment of a substantial property right of the petitioner. As has been noted, the absence of a variance from the lot width requirement would prevent the lot from being subdivided. And then finally, that the granting of the variance will not be detrimental to the public welfare or injurious to other property in the neighborhood. In this case, staff feels that the reduction in lot width would not make these parcels significantly undersized compared to other adjacent properties. By area, they would still be a little bit larger than some to the south, and the new home would still be subject to those zoning restrictions to control its size, form, and location on the lot itself. On the flip side of things, staff notes that, as brought up by some residents at the neighborhood meeting, not subdividing this parcel would allow for the home to be sold, torn down, and replaced with a much larger single-family home that would be fairly out of character with the surrounding neighborhood. In order to approve a minor subdivision, there are 8 factors that must be met for the action to proceed. Staff generally feels that these factors are being met, although we will call out 3 for some action items. Firstly, again, that minimum width requirement is only being met in the case of that variance being approved. Without the variance, it would not be meeting that factor. Secondly, we did note that outside agencies have been involved in the review and do not have conditions at this time for the subdivision. Thirdly, there will be a chance that title review is necessary. That will be determined by the city attorney prior to the approval of the final plat. And finally, a part dedication fee would be collected for the new home in this subdivision. Based on the findings for the subdivision variance itself, staff recommends approval of a variance of 6.56 feet off the required 160 feet to a width of 153.44 feet for the lots width prior to the subdivision. Secondly, if that variance is then approved, we would recommend approval of the minor subdivision itself at 5317 Glenwood Avenue, subject to the following conditions. Firstly, as mentioned, that the city attorney will determine if a title review is necessary. And then secondly, that a park dedication fee of $5,415 shall be paid prior to the release of the final plat. As noted, if the variance is not approved, then that lot width requirement cannot be met by the subdivision, and therefore staff would recommend denial of the minor subdivision with a finding that that proposal does not meet the minimum dimension requirements of the subdivision code.